Welcome to the Clinical File. I'm John Cordray, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Spencer and Monique Tepe case. I'll be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations, it's not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. What internal narrative allows a person to track a vehicle across state lines to commit a double execution while young children sleep nearby? Is it possible for a perpetrator to harbor a grudge for nearly a decade, allowing it to fester into a lethal compulsion? We have to look at the psychological profile of an intruder who seemingly understands the layout of a home and the vulnerability of his targets. This case forces us to ask if the perpetrator experienced a psychological snap, or if this was a culmination of a long, calculated descent into predatory behavior. How does a person reconcile a past life with a present act of an extreme violence? And what does it say about their ability to mask their true intentions? And if a suspect flees 500 miles immediately after the crime, are they running from the law, or are they running from the reality of what they have become? We're going to examine the behavioral evidence that led police from the quiet Columbus Street all the way to Rockford, Illinois. We're going to look at a suspect who would choose a window between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. to destroy a family, leaving behind no sign of forced entry. The facts of this case solidified on January 10, 2026, when an arrest warrant was filled for a 39-year-old Michael McKee. McKee is now charged with 2 counts of murder in the deaths of 37-year-old Spencer Tepe and 39-year-old Monique Tepe. The investigation began on Tuesday morning, December 30, 2025, in the Wyland Park neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. Officers were dispatched to a home in the 1400 block of North 4th Street after Spencer, a dentist, failed to arrive for his morning appointments. When police entered the residence, they discovered a scene that speaks to a high level of emotional detachment and specific intent. Spencer and Monique were found in the upstairs area of the home, both victims of fatal gunshot wounds. The most jarring psychological indicator is the presence of their 2 children, a 4-year-old girl and a 7-month-old baby, who were physically unharmed. From a mental health perspective, we must analyze the suspect's ability to focus entirely on the adult target while ignoring the helpless witness in the next room. This suggests a perpetrator who may have a highly compartmentalized psyche, separating his perceived mission from the collateral trauma of the children. This level of compartmentalization is often seen in individuals who view their victims as objects rather than people. To this type of offender, the children are simply part of the background, like furniture, because they do not play in the role in the perpetrator's internal conflict. The lack of forced entry is a critical behavior clue that often points toward a perpetrator who either had access or a psychological familiarity of the home. It implies a sense of comfort and entitlement, as if the offender felt they still had a right to enter that space. In mental health terms, this could be linked to a failure to recognize boundaries, a common trait in those with narcissistic or antisocial personality features. Investigators used neighborhood surveillance video to identify a vehicle that arrived just before the shootings and left shortly after. The vehicle was eventually tracked to Rockford, Illinois, where police had found evidence linking it directly to Michael McKee. As a therapist, I look at this geographic flight as a clear sign of post-offense distress, even if the act itself was executed with calm precision. The suspect didn't just leave the scene, he fled nearly 500 miles, likely hoping the distance would provide a psychological buffer from the crime. This flight shows a realization of consequences, which tells us the suspect was not experiencing a break from reality. He knew exactly what he had done, and he knew that that was a violation of both the law and social order. McKee was reportedly Monique's ex-husband, with their divorce having been finalized back in 2017. If the suspect harbored a grievance for 8 years, we're looking at a psychological phenomenon known as nurtured resentment. Nurtured resentment is like a slow burning fire that an individual intentionally feeds with negative thoughts and memories. Every time the offender saw a social media post or heard the news of the victim's happiness, it was like adding fuel to the fire. This is when an individual allows past perceived slights to grow into an obsession, eventually viewing the victims not as people, but as obstacles to their own peace. Why would someone wait nearly a decade to act on such dark impulse? Often a stressor event in the perpetrator's current life, such as financial loss or another failed relationship, can trigger a lapse into old obsessions. Psychologically, we call this a catalyst, an event that makes the offender feel they have nothing left to lose. When someone feels they are at the rock bottom, they often look for someone to blame for their current state. In this case, it appears the blame was placed squarely on a woman who had moved on with a man who represented everything the offender lacked. The shooter used 9mm ammunition, and while Spencer was shot multiple times, Monique was shot once in the chest. This variation in the number of shots can sometimes indicate a specific hierarchy of rage or a different psychological relationship with each victim. In many cases of domestic adjacent violence, the primary target receives more overkill, which acts as a physical manifestation of the killer's internal fury. However, a single shot can also represent a different kind of psychological finality, a shutdown of the person the offender once claimed to love. We must also consider the psychological significance of the family dog, a golden doodle who was left alive and unharmed. To a predatory mind, a dog or a child may be viewed as non-combatants, further proving that this was a targeted strike rather than a random act of madness. This selectivity is a major red flag because it shows the offender was able to make a conscious choices throughout the entire event. They weren't blinded by rage. They were making calculated decisions about who deserved to die and who deserved to live. The suspect's behavior in the alleyway, captured on the Nest camera, showed a person moving with a deliberate and steady pace in a freezing temperature. This indicates a high level of executive function during the commission of a crime, meaning the person was not under the influence of a psychotic break. Executive function allows a person to plan, to focus attention, and remember instructions. To carry out a double murder, navigate a home, and successfully flee the state requires a brain that is fully functioning at a very high level of organization. Instead, they were likely operating under a distorted logic, where the murders felt like a necessary or even just conclusion to their internal narrative. This distorted logic is often fueled by a sense of perceived injustice. The offender convinces themselves that they are the true victim and that their actions, even violent actions, are merely a form of evening the score. Spencer's co-workers were the first to sound the alarm, describing him as a man whose reliability was a cornerstone of his personality. He was a dentist who cared for his patients and was deeply involved in mentoring through big brothers and big sisters. When a person with a high degree of conscientiousness goes missing, the psychological ripple effect is immediate and profound for those around them. The sudden absence of such a stable person creates an immediate psychological alarm in the community. The neighbor who called 911 after hearing children crying inside the home highlights the tragic aftermath left by the suspect's lack of empathy. The children were left in the house for hours with their deceased parents, an experience that creates a level of trauma that is difficult to fathom. A perpetrator who can walk away from the sound of a sobbing infant possesses a chilling degree of affective blunting. Affective blunting is a reduction of the intensity of the individual's emotional response. In this context, it means the offender heard the cries and felt nothing, no guilt, no urge to help, and no fear of being caught. This is a state where the emotional signals that normally trigger human compassion are simply ignored or suppressed. The police chief noted that the arrest warrant was the result of meticulous work connecting digital evidence to physical locations. The suspect's move to Illinois suggests that he may have been trying to return to a safe zone or a place where he felt he could reestablish his mask of normalcy. Fleeing to a familiar location is a common psychological behavior for offenders who are trying to reset their lives. They hope that by surrounding themselves with old habits and familiar faces, they can drown out the memory of the crime. However, the psychological leakage of such a crime, the subtle changes in behavior after the act, often gives away even the most careful offenders. Leakage can include increased irritability, social withdrawal, or an obsession with news reports about the crime. Family members and friends have described Spencer and Monique as being madly in love, having married in 2021 and building a life of service. Monique was an educator who spent her life helping children reach their full potential. Their joy and success may have served as a psychological trigger for someone who felt stuck in their own life or bitterness about the past. As a clinician, I often see how the happiness of others can be perceived as an active insult to an individual struggling with a personality disorder. This is especially true if the offender feels that the victim took the life that they were supposed to have. The investigation into Michael McKee continues as authorities process the vehicle and forensic evidence found in Illinois. Every piece of evidence gathered will help build the behavioral timeline of the suspect's movements and state of mind. This is a case of a stark example of how the past can sometimes reach forward into the present with devastating consequences. It teaches us that psychological wounds, if left untreated and allowed to fester, can turn into a dangerous obsession. The psychological flags in this case, the long-term stalking, the calculated timing, and the clinical detachment, will be studied for years. Behavioral analysis will look at the choice of weapon, the time of day, and the lack of a struggle as clues to the offender's personality. The fact that the shooter was an ex-husband brings the element of possessive stalking where the offender cannot accept the victim's autonomy. This type of stalker believes that if they cannot have the person, then no one else should be allowed to either. The focus now shifts to the recovery of the children and the pursuit of justice for a family that was a pillar of their community. The 4-year-old and the 17-month-old are now at the center of a massive support network, but the attachment trauma they may have suffered could be severe. As they grow older, they will likely need specialized care to process the loss of their parents in such a violent manner. As we piece together the motives, we're reminded that the most dangerous threats are often come from those who had once had a place in the inner circle. It's a terrifying thought, but from a psychological perspective, familiarity provides a predator with an ultimate camouflage. The mask of a former spouse or a normal citizen can hide a depth of rage that is invisible until it's too late. The community of Columbus continues to mourn two people who were dedicated to making the world a better place. We must honor their memory by staying aware and understanding the mental health indicators that precede such tragedies. By looking beyond the surface of the crime, we can begin to understand the complex and often dark reality of the human mind. The capture of Michael McKee in Illinois is just the beginning of a long legal and psychological process. We'll be watching closely as more details of his state of mind and his actions following the crime come to light. It's often the post-crime behavior that the true personality of the offender is finally revealed without the mask. This case is such a tragedy when you think about it. We don't know the relationship of Monica and McKee after they got divorced, but it does appear that he was harboring a lot of rage, a lot of anger, specifically towards Spencer, Monica's new husband. This deep-seated, long-standing resentment can fester and build, and without getting help, going to see a therapist with your anger and the resentment and the hurt and the pain, without getting treatment, it will continue to build and reach levels of explosion like we're seeing here. The tragedy of the kids losing their parents in such a way, they may not remember all the details, but certainly their bodies will. They'll relive all of the scenes because it's being shared on the news everywhere. As they reach an age where they get older, my hope is that they'll get help. The parents and grandparents, families, aunts and uncles are really struggling, as you can imagine. This case has so many ripple effects, and yet the perpetrator was single focused. They weren't thinking about what might happen after the fact or how people would feel. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.